Good Shabbos. This week is Parshas Tetzaveh, but as mentioned in the previous weeks, we're going to focus instead on Megillas Esther, leading up to the holiday of Purim, which is in a couple of days. And earlier we spoke about the personalities of Achashverosh and Haman and Mordechai, and this week I'd like to talk about Esther. And the name Esther, to start off with, is often understood to be related to the word of hastara, of hiddenness. And specifically, the word in the Torah, Anochi haster aster panai, I will hide my face, referring to God hiding his face as a punishment to the Jewish people in the Torah. And Esther, of course, is hidden in regard to her identity as being Jewish, but also in the story of the Megillah, the story of Purim, God is never openly present. His name is not mentioned. It's all considered a nes nistar, a hidden miracle. So the theme of the Megillah is hiddenness of God, but also hiddenness of Esther and her identity. Of course, also those that know Esther is not really a Jewish name, because if her name was Esther and everyone knew that she was Jewish, then she couldn't hide her identity. Esther is really probably related to the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, a goddess of fertility, which makes a lot of sense in regard to Esther and the fact that her beauty was what drew her to Achashverosh. But when we Hebraicize her name, it's translated into Esther instead of Ishtar, and Esther being hiddenness. So she's both someone who draws you to her because of her relationship to the relationship to her beauty, but on the other hand, she really remains hidden. And that's, in a sense, the theme of the Megillah. And this interesting theme brings us to understand Esther and the way she parallels a biblical figure, Yosef. Yosef is of course also hidden. His identity is hidden from his brothers. He also has two names, just like Esther's Hebrew name is really Hadassah. Yosef's Hebrew name, of course, is Yosef, but he also has an Egyptian name, Tzafnas Paneach. It's only mentioned once in the Torah, but that seems to be his name, and that was his identity in Egypt. Yosef lives in the house of Paro, in the palace. Esther also lives in the palace of Achashverosh. Yosef never leaves the palace of Paro. After his family comes, he doesn't move to Goshen and goes home to Yaakov and lives with them. No, he still remains apart from his family. He's still part of the Egyptian hierarchy, and he lives in that palace till the end of his days. And so too, interestingly, is Esther. Esther doesn't go home to Mordechai after she reveals herself. It seems, it doesn't say one way or the other, but it seems that she remains in the palace and in the house of Achashverosh. Yosef marries Osnas Bas Potiphera Cohen On. He marries an Egyptian woman. So too does Yosef marry a Persian man, obviously. That's Achashverosh. So they both marry into it. Now there's one difference, whereas originally Yosef refuses to be seduced by Ashes Potiphar, which seems to be a very similar name to Osnas's mother. He refuses, and that's why he's called in rabbinic literature, and specifically in Kabbalistic literature, as Tzaddik Yesod Olam. He's a tzaddik, a righteous person who's the foundation of the world, because he refused to be seduced. We don't see that in Esther, which needs for another discussion. Esther seems to immediately go to Achashverosh, and there doesn't seem to be any refusal. We might be able to differentiate between a man and a woman, but that could be left for another time. But what's interesting about Yosef and Esther is that they both live with these non-Jewish women or men, and they live out their lives both in the palace and staying in that relationship all of their life. Yosef in Kabbalistic literature is called, as I mentioned, Tzaddik Yesod Olam, the righteous who's the foundation of the world, and the Kabbalistic emanation is associated with Yesod, Yesod being the foundation. And Yesod is related to the word also Sod, which is a secret, because the foundation lies beneath the surface, and that very much defines someone who's hidden. And therefore, that would also relate to someone like Esther. Esther also might be, in Kabbalistic terminology, the sphera, the emanation of yesod, of foundation, or a secret. But what's interesting about Esther is that she's also like Yosef. She rises to the level of malchus, of kingdom or royalty. Now, she rose to that right away when she ends up the queen of Achashverosh. But there's a very specific line in the Megillah, which is pointed out by the Maral from Prague. And when she goes in to beg for the Jewish people and ask that the Jewish people are saved from Haman's decree, it says, Vatilbash Esther Malchus. Esther put on royalty. It does not say big day Malchus. It does not say clothes of royalty, but rather just royalty. And the Maral seems to be pointing out that it's saying not just that she wore clothes, but that she actually transitioned from the sphera, the emanation of Yesod, which is foundation, and a secret, to Malchus, to being the last emanation, which is royalty, which is also associated with the feminine aspect of the divine. Again, in Kabbalah, that's also associated with the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which is the feminine aspect of the divine. It's also associated with David, the king, and all of his descendants. But because that's what Malchus really is, that's what kingship really is. But it's important that it's understood as the feminine aspect. And what we have here is that Esther is going from Yesod, going from the secret foundation to Malchus. She transitions. And she's also understood to be related to Mordechai. It says that Mordechai raised her as a daughter, and the Medrash very interestingly says that he was also married to her. It's his cousin. Again, not such a simple reading of the text. But in Kabbalah, it makes sense because Mordechai, as I mentioned the other week, is Tiferes, is beauty, but he's also represented as the heart of the cosmic divine man, so to speak, but the masculine side. And Esther therefore represents the feminine side. And she goes from being Yesod, from being part of the sort of the masculine undercurrent behind the eventual revelation of God, and she ends up revealing herself to be Malchus and to be, in a sense, the king. So she rises up just like Yosef in the story. There's also another a literary reference to Yosef, because by Yosef it says that even though they spoke to him every day to bow to, the wife of Potiphar, Ashes Potiphar, the wife of Potiphar seduced him every day, but he did not listen to her. By Mordechai, it says they spoke to him every day, but he didn't listen to them, not bowing down to Mordechai. That might be an answer to the question we had before, that Mordechai and Esther together represent Yosef to a degree, and Mordechai is the one who refuses. Esther gives in. Yosef first refuses, then he marries Asnas Bas Potiphar Kohen, and he marries the daughter, it seems, of the same woman. So he first refuses, then he gives in. Mordechai refuses to bow down. Esther gives in to marry. It's not exactly the same, but again, as a team, we could see the references to Yosef both in the situation and actually, if you look at the words, the particular words related to Yosef and to Mordechai, they have a very clear relationship. At the end of the day, this is not just a literary analysis, which of course it is, but I think it's also telling you something about the ultimate redemption. That Esther at the end, it becomes like a Yosef figure, that she's redeeming the Jewish people. She's saving the Jewish people. Yosef saved the Jewish people. They were worried about dying of starvation through the famine, and he then makes sure they survive. And of course, he leads them, though, back to Egypt, out of the land of Canaan. And eventually they're going to be redeemed by David, who's many, many generations later, when they then inhabit the land of Israel. But before then, he's sort of given a partial redemption. Esther also, in a sense, is given a partial redemption. She saves them from being destroyed. She saves the Jewish people from being destroyed. So they survive, but they're not yet at the point where they're thriving. It's only later generation, according to most Jewish commentaries, they say that her son, Koresh, is the one who allows the Jews back into the land of Israel. But what's very interesting is that Yosef, of course, is a man and Esther is a woman. And as I mentioned, I think in a previous week, the story of the Megillah might be where we're trying to create some kind of ideal world where masculine and feminine, or man and women, are more equal. It starts off as where Achashverosh is one who says, "You, Vashti, my wife, must come to me." When she refuses, she's banished, and they have a decree that says, "You, all men, must be the boss in their home, and the women have to listen." And at the end of the story, it's just the opposite. Esther is the one who controls Achashverosh, and we're coming to a sense of more of an equalization between the sexes, which did not exist before. So the story of the Megillah is a partial redemption. But as I mentioned, she's still in the house of Achashverosh. The Jews are not completely redeemed. But before that happens, there has to be some kind of equality starting to exist between men and women. In the beginning of the Torah, we have that Adam, and Eve are cursed. And the curse of Eve, of Chava, is that V'hu Yim Shabach, he, man, will rule over you. And now the tables are turned, and it's Esther who rules. Esther's the one who saves the day. She's the one who now controls everything, and she's the one who brings Mordechai into the house of Achashverosh. And just as a last point, it's very interesting that if you look at the language, in the beginning it says Mordechai commanded, it uses the word siva, commanded Esther to do this, to do that, not to reveal herself. And then when Mordechai asks Esther to save the Jewish people and plead for them through Achashverosh, all of a sudden, there's no longer words of Mordechai commanding Esther, but just the opposite. Esther then commands Mordechai. She's taking charge. So the ultimate redemption sees an equality, sees an ideal world that goes back to the pre-eating of the tree of knowledge and goes back to the Garden of Eden. And when that is all set, we're ready for the ultimate redemption. Good Shabbos.